not touching anything anymore. More women's clothes. Button-down shirt.
January 11th, 2026. 3 weeks before anything happened that anyone reported. A Sunday evening in a quiet neighborhood in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. Wide streets, houses set back from the road. The kind of darkness that settles specific to high desert elevation, clear and cold and deep. At some point that evening, someone was at a specific front door. The FBI knows this. Not because a neighbor called it in that night, because weeks later, after everything that followed, investigators went back to the camera hardware. They went back to the residual data. They asked the device what it had seen before its feed was cut, and the device told them about January 11th. The FBI's forensic analysis of the camera hardware produced what investigators describe only in careful, non-specific terms, a belief that the device recorded activity on an earlier date. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed this on camera to a local television station in late March. He would not detail what that activity showed. He said only, "January 11th is a date we'd like people to think about." The Guthrie family then released a public statement, in coordination with the investigation, asking the community to search their memories. 2 dates named specifically: January 31st, the night of the abduction, and January 11th, 3 weeks earlier, before the blood, before the missing person report, before the FBI, before any of it. Someone was there. And this video is about what that visit tells us, not about the crime that followed, but about the person who stood at that door 3 weeks before they came back. 3 sources understood January 11th differently. None of them has the complete picture. Together, they define the question the investigation is trying to answer. The first source is the forensic record. The doorbell camera at the front entrance of the Catalina Foothills home was not set to record continuously because the subscriber tier did not include cloud storage. But Ring cameras transmit data in real time to Amazon's back-end servers during the brief seconds they are active. The motion detection trigger activates the device. The device sends its data before any local storage decision is made. What the FBI found in the residual back-end data is not a complete video record. It is a forensic ghost. Something was there. The camera saw it. The timestamp is recoverable. The specific visual detail of what the camera captured that night remains inside the investigation and has not been released. The second source is the community. Aldine Meister, a 30-year resident of the Catalina foothills, reported to investigators in the first days of the inquiry that she had seen a stranger in the neighborhood approximately 2 to 3 weeks before Nancy's disappearance. A man in street clothing, not the hiking gear or jogging attire typical of the neighborhood. Hat pulled low, hunched, moving with purpose, but without the kind of destination that makes a person's presence legible to an observer. She clocked him as wrong. She filed it away. Then February 1st happened, and she called. 2 to 3 weeks before February 1st places that sighting in the window between January 11th and January 18th. Meister cannot pin the date precisely, but the window aligns. The third source is the FBI. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendafer assessed publicly that the masked individual captured on the doorbell camera footage was at the door on January 11th, for reasons she described with a specific professional term. Trial run. Someone coming to the property not to act, but to observe, to verify, to confirm what they needed to confirm before returning to execute. 3 sources. A ghost in the camera data, a stranger in a neighbor's memory, a professional framework from someone who has run investigations like this. None of them tells us what January 11th looked like from inside the house, because the person inside the house was asleep and did not know anything was happening at all. What is a trial run, operationally? The term gets used in coverage of this case, but it deserves to be unpacked, because what a trial run actually is determines what January 11th tells us about the person who conducted it. A trial run is not curiosity. It is not a preliminary visit to confirm a location exists. A trial run is a structured rehearsal of a specific operational sequence, performed before the actual execution, for the purpose of identifying variables that the plan has not yet accounted for. It means January 11th had a script. Someone arrived at that property with a sequence of actions they intended to perform. They performed some version of those actions. They observed the results. They left. And between January 11th and February 1st, They revised the plan based on what they learned. What would that rehearsal specifically need to verify? The first variable, the camera, its position relative to the entrance, the angle of its field of view, whether its indicator light was active, signaling a live subscription, or dormant, whether it was physically accessible from the position a person would occupy when approaching the front entrance. The answers to those questions determine how to approach the door on the night of the operation without triggering a usable recording. The second variable, the doorbell itself, whether a visitor using the doorbell would trigger the camera before reaching the position needed to disable it, whether the approach angle from the street allowed someone to reach the camera before the motion detection zone was crossed. The third variable, the neighborhood rhythm on a Sunday evening, which houses had lights on, which were dark, whether any neighboring property had a direct sightline to the front door, whether foot traffic in the street at that hour was present or absent, what the ambient sound level was, whether the street felt empty or populated. The fourth variable, response time. If something went wrong at the front of the house, how long before someone on the street would notice? How long before a neighbor's own camera would capture something? The answer to that question determines how much time the plan can afford to spend at the front entrance. A trial run on January 11th answers all of those questions, not hypothetically, by physically executing the approach and observing in real time how the environment responds. And here is the micro detail that most coverage has not examined in the context of January 11th. The masked figure who returned on February 1st improvised at the camera. He used a plant from the yard to block the lens. He did not bring a prepared camera-defeating tool. That improvisation has been interpreted correctly as evidence of imperfect planning. But it is also evidence of something the January 11th visit produced as a conclusion. He learned on January 11th that the camera could not simply be avoided, that his approach to the entrance would trigger its motion detection zone before he could reach it, that he needed to disable it, not bypass it. But he also concluded, incorrectly, that disabling it in the moment with available materials would be sufficient. January 11th produced a plan that said, deal with the camera at the door on the night. It did not produce a plan that said, bring a specific tool to do that. The improvisation on February 1st is the direct descendant of a decision made on January 11th, and that decision is visible in the gap between the sophistication of the preparation and the improvised execution. Now examine what January 11th tells us about the suspect's relationship to this specific property, because a trial run is not conducted at a property you have never observed before. You do not arrive cold and rehearse. You arrive having already watched, and the trial run confirms what the watching produced. That means there was a phase before January 11th, a passive observation phase, a period during which the suspect was present near enough to the property to build a working picture of the routines, the camera placement, the neighborhood rhythms, the specific vulnerability profile of this particular 84-year-old woman living alone in a house in the Catalina foothills. The FBI's questions to residents about the vacant rental property adjacent to Nancy's home and their simultaneous canvass of construction workers by individual name for the weeks of January are both pointing at the same question. Who had legitimate cover to be in proximity to that street in the period before January 11th? The timeline that emerges from all of the publicly available evidence has 3 phases, not 2. Phase 1, passive observation, an unknown start date. The suspect, by whatever method, identified Nancy Guthrie as a target, located her address, and began learning the observable patterns of the property from a position that allowed them to be present without triggering suspicion. Phase 2, January 11th, the trial run, a more active contact with the property. The camera motion detection was triggered. The FBI found residual data. The approach was tested. Conclusions were drawn and translated into revisions to the plan. Phase 3, February the 1st, the execution. Most coverage frames this case as a 2-act structure. What happened the night of January 31st and the investigation that followed. The January 11th evidence introduces a 3rd act that precedes both, an act that the investigation is working backwards into, trying to establish not just what happened on the night of the crime, but what happened 3 weeks earlier and in the weeks before that. Now apply the technical evidence to the Phase 1 and Phase 2 framework. The Ring Neighbors app alert asked residents to check their systems for footage from January 11th between 9 p.m. and midnight. That is a specific evening window on a specific Sunday. If the suspect arrived during that window, it was not a random night. Sunday evenings in a residential neighborhood have a specific rhythm. Family activity winds down after dinner. Children go to bed. The quiet of a Sunday night settles earlier than a Friday or Saturday. Foot traffic on residential streets drops sharply by 9 p.m. For an operation that needed to approach a front entrance without being observed by passing pedestrians or visible neighbors. Sunday after 9 p.m. is a specifically well-chosen window. The fact that January 11th was a Sunday and the alert asked specifically about that evening is not a detail that occurred to investigators randomly. Then there is the January 31st daytime sighting at 10 a.m. The Ring neighbor's alert also mentioned a suspicious vehicle spotted near Nancy Street in the morning on the day of the abduction. A vehicle observed in the area 14 hours before the operation began. This is not reconnaissance from 3 weeks earlier. This is real-time monitoring on the day of the execution. Someone was in the neighborhood during daylight on January 31st, confirming the conditions, watching the morning routine to ensure the evening's circumstances would match what the plan anticipated, confirming Nancy was home, confirming no unexpected visitors had arrived, confirming the operational picture matched the template established across the prior 3 weeks. The gap between 10 a.m. on January 31st and 1:47 a.m. on February the 1st is 15 hours and 47 minutes. In that window, the plan moved from final confirmation to execution. Now consider what is known about the suspect's approach to the camera on February 1st and what it reveals about the specific conclusions January 11th produced. He improvised at the camera, a plant from the yard, pulled and used to block the lens. He did not bring a specific tool designed for camera disabling. Every expert who analyzed the footage noted this. Former FBI agent Mark Harrigan said a sophisticated person would have brought something from the beginning, but the January 11th framework reframes that improvisation. It was not simply a failure of preparation, it was the execution of a decision that January 11th produced. On January 11th, the suspect assessed the camera and reached a conclusion. This device cannot be avoided on approach. The motion detection zone is wide enough that any path to the front entrance will trigger it. The camera must be dealt with on contact, at the door. That conclusion was correct, but the plan it generated, improvised with available materials at the moment of approach, produced a result the footage now documents in detail. The trial run identified the problem accurately. The solution it generated was wrong, and between January 11th and February 1st, the plan kept the wrong solution, because no one challenged the assumption. There was no stress test of the approach. No verification that grabbing a plant and holding it in front of the lens would prevent useful recording. 21 days between the trial run and the execution. That gap is not nothing. A person who conducted a trial run on January 11th and immediately returned would produce a pattern connecting the two visits that is far easier to detect. 3 weeks of separation allows the neighborhood's ambient awareness of unusual activity on January 11th to fade. It allows any neighbor who saw something to stop actively thinking about it. It creates operational distance between the reconnaissance and the crime. That distance is deliberate, and it reflects a specific kind of planning intelligence, understanding that time is itself a tool for managing detection risk. Go back further, before January 11th, to the question of how this specific address became a target in the first place. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television. She has co-anchored NBC's Today Show since 2012. Her salary and professional profile are matters of public record, discussed in industry coverage, referenced in profiles, attached to her name in thousands of online articles. Her family connections have been mentioned across those years of coverage, including references to her mother and her siblings. Her mother lived not in New York, not in a city with the security infrastructure that surrounds someone of Savannah's public profile, but in Tucson, Arizona, in a residential neighborhood, in a house accessible from the street, with a standard residential doorbell camera and no dedicated security. The process of identifying Nancy Guthrie as a target required exactly 2 things: knowledge of Savannah Guthrie's existence and public profile, and basic internet research into her family. Neither of those things requires access to restricted information. Both of them are available to anyone with a search engine and a specific kind of intent. Cameron Guthrie understood this on the morning of February the 1st, before any ransom note existed. His background in military intelligence gives him a specific analytical lens. Who benefits, who has the means, and who has identified the accessible point of leverage. He told his sister immediately, "I think she's been kidnapped for ransom." And when she asked whether it was because of her, he said, "Yeah, maybe." That assessment, from a retired Air Force colonel with an intelligence background, means the identification phase of this operation began not with physical surveillance, but with digital research. Someone sitting at a device, not in the Catalina foothills, not anywhere near Tucson necessarily, building a target profile from publicly available information, learning that Savannah Guthrie's mother lived alone in Arizona, finding the general neighborhood, then, at some subsequent point, finding the specific address. The transition from digital research to physical presence is the moment the operation becomes material. And the earliest physical presence the evidence documents in this specific neighborhood is the passive observation phase before January 11th. One way to date the beginning of that phase comes from the construction worker investigation. The FBI asked about January work by individual names. If the passive observation phase used construction site presence as cover, the FBI's canvas is aimed at establishing when that cover was in place. A worker who began a job in early January would have had an available window from the beginning of the month. A worker who began in late December would have had even longer. The construction question and the January 11th question are aimed at the same moment. When did physical surveillance of this property begin? And what cover identity made it operationally sustainable? Now, apply Coffindaffer's trial run framework to what January 11th added beyond verification of the camera and the neighborhood rhythm. A trial run also tests one's own psychological readiness. The theoretical distance between planning an operation and executing it is significant. There are things a person can plan and then find, upon physical contact with the actual environment, that their internal state does not match what the plan assumed. The sight of the specific front door, the specific darkness of that specific street, the specific sound of the neighborhood at the specific hour. A trial run on January 11th calibrated not only the operational environment, but the operator's relationship to it, whether they could approach that door without hesitation, whether the sight of the camera triggered a response they needed to manage, whether the environment felt controllable in the way the plan assumed it would. Between January 11th and February 1st, 21 days passed. That gap is not nothing. It is not the behavior of someone who conducted a trial run and immediately executed. It is the behavior of someone who went away, processed what they had learned, revised the plan, let the gap create distance from the January 11th activity in the neighborhood's memory, and returned. The 21-day gap is itself evidence of a specific kind of discipline, or of a constraint that required it. Now bring the DNA evidence into the January 11th framework. The mixed male DNA of unknown origin recovered from inside Nancy's home was sent to DNA Labs International in Deerfield Beach, Florida, on a rush basis. The lab agreed to deploy analytical technology not originally scheduled for public use until later in 2026. Sheriff Nanos confirmed the sample has challenges. It is mixed, containing contributions from more than one person, which requires specialized processing to separate individual profiles. C.C. Moore of Parabon Nanolabs stated publicly the person who left that DNA will be identified. She did not say might be, she said will be. But here is what the trial run framework adds to the DNA picture. If the January 11th visit involved the suspect approaching the front door closely enough to interact with the camera or the door hardware, then January 11th may have produced a DNA deposition event independent of February the 1st. Touch DNA transfers from skin contact, a gloved hand on a door frame. Any physical contact between a person and a surface leaves cellular material that forensic processing can recover weeks later. Gloves are not a complete barrier to touch DNA deposition. The seams of gloves transfer. The backs of gloves contact surfaces in ways the glove wearer does not always control. More specifically, C.C. Moore raised the bite light as a mechanism through which the suspect likely transferred DNA inside Nancy's home on February the 1st. The flashlight visible in the footage held in the mouth to free both hands. When it exits the mouth, saliva transfers to the gloves. When the gloves contact any surface, that saliva follows. Any door, any wall, any object contacted during transit through the house. If the same person held the same or a similar flashlight in their mouth during the January 11th visit, the same mechanism operated. And if they contacted any surface at the front entrance during that visit, the January 11th DNA deposition is sitting in the same forensic collection pool as the February 1st deposition from inside the house. Cross-referencing those collections, a biological sample from the entrance area with a date range that includes January 11th and a sample from inside the house from February 1st, producing the same unknown male profile in both, would establish not only that someone was present at the crime scene, it would establish that they were present there twice, intentionally, with a gap consistent with the investigative timeline. Now add the shoe evidence. The blood on the front porch contains what forensic analysts examining the photographs described as a footwear impression within the drops. Nancy was barefoot. The impression belongs to someone else who was present while she was bleeding. Forensic shoe print databases can identify sole patterns by make and model from a clear impression. If the same footwear was worn on both January 11th and February 1st, and if the entrance surfaces retained any impression from the January visit through 3 weeks of ordinary use, there is a potential comparison point. 2 impressions from the same shoes on the same property. One from the planning phase, one from the execution. The FBI's evidence response team, processing a property for a case of this profile, and knowing January 11th is forensically significant, would have specifically searched the entrance area for impressions from prior visits. Whether those impressions were recoverable after 3 weeks of regular foot traffic at the entrance is an analytical question the FBI's forensic specialists are positioned to answer. An entrance mat, a soft substrate just inside the door threshold, a step surface that retains compression patterns longer than hard flooring. Any of those could have held the January 11th impression long enough for recovery. The DNA analysis, the impression evidence, and the surveillance footage from 6 cameras are all tracking different physical records of the same person across 2 separate visits. Each track produces its own evidence chain. When they converge on the same profile, from 2 dates, from the same property, the case they collectively build is qualitatively different from any single event forensic collection. Former FBI agent Steve Moore noted that the investigation is proceeding on multiple simultaneous tracks: the DNA, the digital forensics from seized phones, the surveillance footage, the construction worker interviews, the vacant property inquiry. Each track is independent. Each produces its own evidence. When 2 or more tracks converge on the same name, the evidentiary architecture that convergence produces is exponentially stronger than any single track alone. January 11th is the thread that connects the tracks to a period before the crime. Evidence from before the crime is not the same as evidence from the crime. It describes intent. It describes planning. It describes the decision that was already in motion when Nancy Guthrie went to sleep that Sunday night without knowing anyone was at her door. There is a specific behavioral detail from February 1st that only makes sense when you have the January 11th framework in place. The suspect spent 41 minutes inside the property. Every former FBI agent and behavioral expert who has publicly analyzed this case has noted that 41 minutes is a long time for a targeted abduction. Former Supervisory Special Agent Jim Clemente called it a very long time. He noted the extended presence significantly increased the operational risk of detection. The conventional explanation for the long window is operational complexity. 1 or more people moving through the house, controlling a mobile limited 84-year-old woman, transiting her from a rear bedroom to a front exit, pausing at the threshold, coordinating an exit to a vehicle. All of that is valid. But there is another dimension to the 41-minute window that the January 11th trial run illuminates: the suspect's knowledge of the interior of the property. A trial run on January 11th that stayed at the front entrance gives the operator knowledge of the exterior, camera placement, approach angles, neighborhood rhythm, entry points visible from the street. But it does not give them knowledge of the interior, the specific layout of the house, where the bedroom is relative to the back entry point, how many rooms to transit, what obstacles exist in the interior passage from rear to front. If the suspect did not have interior knowledge, their transit through the house on February 1st required navigation of an unfamiliar space in the dark, with limited light, while managing a person who could not move quickly. That navigation would take longer than a planned route through a known interior. It would require pauses, wrong turns, moments of orientation before continuing. 41 minutes of interior time from someone who had never been inside is a different operational picture than 41 minutes from someone who had mapped the layout in advance. If the suspect did not enter the property on January 11th, or did not have any other means of establishing interior knowledge before February 1st, then the extended timeline is explained partly by the unfamiliarity of the space they were moving through. Now reread the satellite spatter evidence documented in the blood on the front porch. The secondary droplets that form when blood falls into blood that has already landed indicate the source remained stationary at the threshold for a meaningful duration, not simply passed through, paused. Someone unfamiliar with the interior passage of this specific house, who has just transited a property in the dark for the first time while managing another person, might pause at the threshold to orient themselves to the exterior and to the vehicle waiting beyond the front path, to confirm which direction to move, to confirm the vehicle is where it should be. That pause is visible in the blood, and the unfamiliarity that may have caused it is traceable to the boundaries of what January 11th could and could not have established as knowledge of the property. The trial run, by staying at the exterior, left a gap in the plan's operational knowledge. That gap showed up as a pause at the threshold on February 1st, and the pause is in the blood. Here is what the evidence confirms with certainty about the January 11th dimension of this case. The FBI's forensic analysis of the camera hardware produced a sustained investigative belief that the device captured activity on January 11th. Sheriff Nanos confirmed this on record in a local television interview in March 2026. The Guthrie family publicly named January 11th, in coordination with the investigating agency, as a date they wanted the community to actively remember. The Ring Neighbors app circulated an alert asking residents to check their systems for footage from January 11th between 9 p.m. and midnight. 3 independent confirmations, from law enforcement, from the family, and from the community alert system, all pointing at the same date. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendafer publicly characterized the January 11th activity as a trial run. That is her professional assessment, not an official FBI statement. She has been consistently credentialed in her public commentary on this case. Aldine Meister's independent account of seeing a stranger in the neighborhood 2 to 3 weeks before February 1st creates a time frame that overlaps with January 11th. Here is what is probable, based on the available evidence but not confirmed. That the January 11th visit was the second phase of a 3-phase operation, preceded by a passive observation phase and followed by the February 1st execution. That the visitor on January 11th and the suspect on February 1st are the same person. That the behavioral evidence of improvisation at the camera on February 1st reflects conclusions drawn during the January 11th trial run about the camera's operability. That the 41-minute interior timeline on February 1st is partly explained by limited interior knowledge that a January 11th trial run remaining at the exterior could not have provided. Here is what cannot be proven from the publicly available record, what the camera's residual data specifically shows from January 11th, whether the suspect made physical contact with the property on that date in a way that left recoverable touch DNA, whether any impression evidence from the January 11th visit exists on the entrance surfaces, whether the vacant property or a construction worker presence in the neighborhood during the first 2 weeks of January connects to the person who appeared on the doorbell camera on both dates. The FBI is working to close those gaps. The DNA analysis is ongoing. The surveillance footage review continues. The seized phone GPS data is being cross-referenced. Somewhere in that work is a question specifically about January 11th, because the answer to that question is not just about one night. It is about an entire planning operation that was built across 3 weeks, and that left evidence before the crime itself that the investigation is now working to fully recover. There is a specific quality to what the January 11th evidence introduces into this investigation that most coverage of missing person cases does not address directly. When a crime is documented by the crime itself, the evidence available is limited to what occurred at the time and place of the criminal act. The blood, the camera footage, the biological material, the physical state of the scene. But when a crime is documented by its planning, When the preparatory phase of the operation left its own forensic traces, the evidentiary record extends backward in time from the crime to include the period when the crime was still a plan, when the suspect was still someone who had not yet done what they came to do, when the neighborhood was still ordinary, when Nancy Guthrie was still asleep in her bed on a Sunday night in January, with no knowledge that anyone was standing at her door. That temporal extension of the forensic record is what January 11th represents in this investigation. Not additional evidence of the crime. Evidence from before the crime existed as a crime. It means the investigation is not only asking who did this, it is asking who stood at that door 3 weeks earlier, when this was still a plan, when there was still a moment in which a decision could have gone differently, when the person on the other side of the camera was still someone who had not yet crossed the line they crossed on February 1st. That question is both forensic and philosophical. The forensic version is being answered by the FBI's analytical work on the camera data, the DNA, the seized phones, the surveillance footage. The philosophical version asks something different. What does it mean to document the planning of a crime that has not yet occurred? What does it mean to recover evidence from a moment when the outcome was not yet fixed? The community alert asked residents to search their memories for January 11th, not to remember the crime. The crime had not happened yet. To remember an ordinary Sunday evening in January in which something was present in their neighborhood that should not have been. Something that was not yet a crime but was already, in the judgment of investigators, the beginning of one. Someone in that neighborhood saw something on January 11th. Not necessarily something that looked wrong, something ordinary. A car that belonged to someone they did not recognize. A face at a distance that did not register as belonging. A sound outside at an hour that was slightly unusual but easily explained away. That memory, still sitting in someone's recall as probably nothing, may be the piece that closes the gap between January 11th and a name. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Tips can be submitted at tips.fbi.gov. If you were in the Catalina foothills on the evening of January 11th, 2026, between 9 p.m. and midnight, and you saw anything, call. Tell me in the comments, does the three-phase operational framework, passive observation before January 11th, trial run on January 11th, execution on February 1st, change how you understand the sophistication of this crime? And if touch DNA from January 11th exists on the entrance surfaces of that property, independent of the February 1st collection, what does a cross-date match from the same location tell us about the evidentiary case that can be built? Subscribe to the Investigation Room and turn on notifications. The investigation is answering questions the public does not yet know have been asked. When those answers surface, you will want to have followed every step of how they were reached. This investigation was presented with respect for Nancy Guthrie and her family. Our goal is to examine the evidence and search for truth, not to sensationalize tragedy. We believe these cases deserve serious, thorough, and respectful coverage. Nancy Guthrie was asleep on the night of January 11th. Someone was at her door and she did not know. 3 weeks later they came back, and this time they did not leave without her. The evidence of both nights exists. The investigation is recovering it. And when the question of who was at that door on January 11th is finally answered, it will answer the same question about February 1st at the same time.